Does anyone still believe that Ireland, or even Europe, is a democracy? If you still do, then I hope to change your mind over the coming minutes. If I don't fully succeed in doing so, then I hope to at least start a debate in your minds and urge you to seek solutions. I have worked at the coalface of where business and politics meet for over 40 years, and to say the least, it has not been pretty. Time and again, our people cry out for fairness, for change, to put the public interest first. But time and again, the corporate interest wins out. Some of you will have heard of Davos and Bilderberg, low-key, high-level conferences attended by elite politicians and global business figures. We don't know very much about what goes on behind the scenes, but we do know that the corporate hold over the body politic just gets stronger and stronger. Brussels, too, the focal point of our European Union, is a place I have been visiting and interacting with for over a quarter of a century. What brought me there? I suppose I was looking for help. Help for myself, help for SMEs, farmers, and indeed citizens who, like me, had found themselves up against a wall of corruption, incompetence, and greed in a country where accountability is an absolute no-no, where white-collar criminality is something to be celebrated and white-collar criminals become heroes at their local golf clubs. So have I been met by knights in shining armour on the outskirts of Brussels waving the Treaty of Rome at me? You guessed. The treaty, the central plank of the EU, has been usurped by global corporate power. Ladies and gentlemen, our system is failing us, and failing us dramatically. Let's look at the reasons why, before looking at some sector-specific examples. Our political system. My late and dear friend, Robert Durward, was something of an expert on broken political systems. He, like me, believed that many of the difficulties we face are down to the corrosive and divisive effect of party political tribalism, which in turn has given us food banks, homeless crisis, hospital waiting lists, vulture funds, and a generation, or even generations, that will struggle to pay the debts created by a broken political system. Time and again, we find that rather than assess the situation and work together to resolve it, our politicians simply resort to petty point scoring, name-calling, and taking intentionally obstructive positions. What might be a bad policy one week is adopted as a good policy the next week, purely out of party advantage to try and retain or gain power, rather than because objective, evidence-based assessment convinced anyone. Parties continually adopt groupthink to protect themselves and even each other, making it near impossible for the public to have any influence on issues that they care deeply about. I am happy to go further and declare that our political system is corrupt to the core. And here's why. Globally acclaimed anti-corruption organization, Transparency International, describes corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It can be classified as grand, petty, and political, depending on the amounts of money lost and the sector where it occurs. Transparency International had this to say about Ireland. Successive tribunals of inquiry over the past several decades have revealed near systemic levels of grand corruption in politics, government, and business. The final report of a long-running corruption tribunal found endemic and systemic corruption in Irish political life and exposed corrupt and inappropriate payments from business people to politicians. The report goes on. The Maye Tribunal said corruption affected every level of government in the decade up to the late 90s, from some holders of top ministerial office to some local councillors. It found that its existence was widely known and tolerated. While this corruption was occasionally investigated or subject to adverse comment, those involved operated with a justified sense of impunity and invincibility. But Transparency International also talks about a second type of corruption called legal corruption. And it says that legal corruption played a role in the poor regulation and weak oversight of financial institutions, which led to Ireland's banking crisis. Renowned economists Daniel Kaufman and Pedro Vincent describe legal corruption as taking many forms, including cronyism, patronage, and state capture, when powerful groups manipulate policy formation to serve their own interests rather than the public interest. Ireland is a cesspool of legal corruption. Just a little word on banking. Having listened intently to experts such as Diarmuid O'Flynn and whistleblower Jonathan Sugarman, to name but two, I am struck by the monumental criminal scam that was going on in Ireland's banking sector, aided and abetted by the financial regulator, the government, the EU, and the ECB. Renowned American lawyer, Professor Bill Black, in his role as prosecutor, incarcerated over 1,000 bankers in the 1980s following the US savings and loans scandal. Oh, for a Bill Black in Ireland. But legal corruption has put paid to that. Nothing should interfere with the transfer of wealth to the 1%. When the Irish people were on their knees after the banking crash, instead of rebanking the nation, which was the obvious thing to do, the government brought in a host of vulture funds to, in the words of a wholly deluded Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan, clean up dead animals that are littered across the landscape. So that's what the people of Ireland are. Mere carcasses. I thought the carcasses were the banks that had died. Well, died until the Irish people were forced by the EU and ECB to put a staggering 69 billion euros into the dead carcasses to bring them back to life. And for good measure, Minister Noonan decided to give the vultures tax-free status. Our government lied to us and ultimately capitulated to the bondholders. The Department of Finance met vulture funds 65 times during 2013 and 14. Minister Noonan attended 8 of these meetings, including with Lone Star and Apollo. And guess what? Brian Goggin, CEO of Bank of Ireland at the time we bailed it out, was an executive with Apollo. It's funny how the world goes around, isn't it? Minister Noonan wasn't so quick to meet advocacy groups. During this time, he met none. That's access to power for you. Again, best described as legal corruption. To this day, vultures and pillar banks are terrorizing Irish SMEs, small and medium businesses, asset stripping them, throwing families on the side of the road when they have perfectly viable businesses, and the same is going on with the farming community. All this time, the government stands idly by as our housing stock, built with blood, sweat and tears, is handed over to foreign corporate interests. Government TDs duck, dive and hide while their constituents are raped and plundered. Now, let's be in no doubt, we can have a great country. We can have the best little country in the world, in fact. But we must unshackle our indigenous economy. This will never be achieved while pillar banks control 95% of the banking market. Pillar banks are not lending to the SME sector in any meaningful way. They're not interested. Where they are lending, rates charged are artificially high, up to 5 times what our counterparts in Germany and France are paying. In Germany, pillar banks, including Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank, have a wildly contrasting 12.5% market share. Just 12.5 for the pillar banks in Germany, 95 in Ireland. The fact is that the German economy, Europe's most successful economy by some distance, is grounded upon public and community banking, which holds some 70% of the German banking market. The public community banking model in Germany is 200 years old. It is not profit maximizing. It makes enough to grow its lending locally and contributes enormously to local communities. It doesn't lend for speculation. It never received taxpayers' money or bailouts or anything like that. You can get a mortgage from Germany's Sparkasse Public Bank over 30 years at a rate of 1.1%, fixed for 10 years. You can get a business loan at anywhere between 1% and 3%. Now that sounds very much like behaving in the public interest. But that is the very reason that we don't have public or community banking in Ireland. The government act in the public interest. You wish. Successive governments have placed unsustainable restrictions on the credit union movement that surely run contrary to Irish and European competition law. Governments also continually debate saving the post offices, and they come up with inane and unworkable proposals, while the answer is staring government and the Department of Finance straight in the face. We need to remodel the post office network on the lines of New Zealand's Kiwi Bank. Kiwi Bank was launched in 2002 under the full ownership of the New Zealand state. The bank has grown to now have 20% of the New Zealand banking market. Leading global banking expert, US Attorney Ellen Brown, had this to say about Kiwi Bank. Postal banks are now thriving in New Zealand. When they were instituted in 2002, it was not to save the post offices, but to save New Zealand families and small business from big bank predators. By 2001, Australian megabanks controlled some 80% of New Zealand's retail banking. Profits were maximised by closing less profitable branches, especially in rural areas. Sound familiar? But the Irish government won't budge. Because, of course, developing the post office network and unshackling the credit unions is in the public interest. And remember, our dysfunctional political circus just doesn't do the public interest. That's why government continues to ignore Article 45, subsection 2(4) of Ireland's Constitution. What that says is this, that in what pertains to the control of credit, the constant and predominant aim shall be the welfare of the people as a whole. We joined the European Community, or the Single Market, back in 1973. But almost 50 years later, I don't see much of a single market. We don't have a single market in bank interest rates, in insurance, in motor cars, in pharmaceuticals. And we bailed out the euro. Not much in the public interest here. Our politicians continue to rip us off at every turn. Just who is capturing who? Now, time doesn't allow me to elaborate much on CETA, which is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Europe and Canada. But suffice it to describe one feature of CETA. It's called ISDS mechanisms, Investor-State Dispute Settlements. Our government are champing at the bit to introduce ISDS with the full support of Fianna Fáil. By way of explanation, if a sovereign state, for example Ireland, introduces a rule, a regulation, a directive or law that might potentially affect the profits of a corporation, the corporation can sue Ireland. But not through the High Court, or the Supreme Court, or even the European Courts of Justice. No, through private corporate courts. Is this not the ultimate example of political capture and legal corruption? Criminal price-fixing cartels, a subject that is close to my heart. Based on estimates provided by the then Competition Authority back in 2004, these criminal practices are costing the Irish economy more than €5 billion per year. That's circa €3,000 per household per year that has been stolen by criminal cartels. I believe the figure to be substantially higher. All these cartels seem to have avoided scrutiny from the hapless Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, just another failed regulator. During the 2016 general election campaign, I attended a meeting between farmers and general election candidates in my constituency of Sligo Leitrim. Several farmers raised the issue of cartels in their sector. One sitting government member responded by saying, "Unfortunately, there is nothing we can do about the cartels." Wow, now that's political capture. I have dealt extensively with the Competition Authority since 1991 and with the ODCE, the Office of Corporate Enforcement, since 2001. And I have kept a close eye on the central bank over recent years. And I can tell you tonight that to all intent and purposes, these are phony regulators, phony by design, because nothing must interfere with the political circus's white-collar criminal protection racket. Let's just for a moment turn our attention to access to justice, another favourite of mine, and a core plank of Ireland's constitution. It is the responsibility of government to enshrine the Constitution into effective functioning laws so that the Constitution works for all citizens. Currently, the court system in Ireland benefits big business and others with deep pockets, but it discriminates against ordinary citizens and SMEs. At the end of the day, we must all have an equal opportunity to go before the courts and air our grievances. We may be proved right, or we may not, but we must have equal opportunity, in line with the European Convention on Human Rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and the Bangalore Principles. However, Irish litigants are denied the use of third-party funding or contingency arrangements with their lawyers. This constitutes a huge barrier to justice. The Irish government refuses to change the rules. Why? Because, of course, to do so would be in the public interest. And as we know, Ireland doesn't do the public interest. More legal corruption, more political capture. I have made complaints of serious criminal breaches of both company and competition law to the last 3 Garda commissioners, all of which were binned. More legal corruption and more political capture. And just a quick word on the media. I'm conscious that my esteemed colleague, Gemma O'Doherty, will be addressing you later and is eminently more qualified to discuss media with you. However, with a background of 22 years of litigation against, among others, Ireland's largest company, CRH plc, and my involvement in the public and community banking debate, my involvement with Right to Homes and CETA campaigns, I have had quite some interaction with Irish media for several decades. I am aghast at the level of control exerted by vested corporate and political interests over media. It makes me smile when I hear these weapons of the bodies, corporate and politic, complaining of fake news. In my experience, they are the masters of fake and distorted news. I have found the state broadcaster, RTE, to be but a puppet of the sitting government. I have raised very legitimate concerns with successive Director Generals of RTE, but my concerns fall on deaf ears. I don't blame journalists, not at all. I blame corporate and government control of the agenda. I understand that journalists in mainstream media have mortgages, childcare, car loans, etc., and have to do their master's bidding to a greater or lesser extent. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that I have succeeded in getting across to you why Ireland has effectively abandoned democracy and made the dangerous shift to corpocracy. We must renegotiate our culture and our ethos with ourselves. We should not accept a failed political circus anymore, one that has destroyed our socio-economy. We need to give ourselves back power, power to call referenda, power to recall elected representatives. We need to tackle the cancerous party whip. We need to stop using the Senate as a creche for party political wannabes and a retirement home for party political failures, and put competent and experienced people in instead and give them more power. Movements like 1YI have been founded to lobby so that the Irish people can veto legislation, initiate new legislation and constitutional amendments. We must introduce accountability into our daily lives and start holding elected representatives, political parties and public servants to account. And that means hitting them in the pocket and committing them to prison for serious misdemeanors. Let us take the power back. Thank you for your attention.